Wir nannten uns Kriegsberichterstatter.
We were called war cameramen, and we went through enough to know it was a profession invented by the devil.
Wir kamen alle von den deutschen Filmindustrien und aufgrund unserer beruflichen Qualifikationen.
Most of us had been working in the film industry, and we were ordered to bring along our equipment and join the army.
Jeder andere Soldat mit der Waffe in der Hand kämpfte. So war die Waffe des Kameramanns die.
The real soldier had a gun in his hands. Our weapon was a camera. But like him, we were sent into the very heart of the action, and our casualties were high. The evidence is in the footage we shot.
Diese Unterlagen und diese Beweise sind ja zugegen.
Dr. Joseph Goebbels was a fan of Hollywood, but no Hollywood studio boss ever commanded the power and resources of Hitler's young minister of propaganda. Every film and every budget had to be approved by Goebbels in the Third Reich and later in the occupied territories. The establishment of the Nazi dictatorship and its promotion of the Second World War gave Goebbels, who had earned his doctorate with a thesis on romantic literature, a script which he pursued with a passion and determination that the Western Allies never thought of matching. Though he banned American films being shown to the German public early in 1941, he continued to show Hollywood product to his filmmakers as an example of what they should be doing. Dr. Fritz Hitler was promoted in 1938 from editor-in-chief of the German newsreel to Reichsfilmintendant, executive head of the German film industry.
Ich lernte Dr. Goebbels kennen, als ich noch Schüler war.
I first saw Goebbels when I was a student. Like most people in Berlin, I saw him from a distance at one of his big meetings.
Und war fasziniert von seinem Äußeren, von seiner Physiognomie.
I was fascinated by his appearance and the power his oratory gave him over great crowds.
Eindringlichen Rednergabe. Erschien mir als eine Art Prophet.
He seemed to me like a prophet, and at the same time a prototype for the German working man as we then thought about him.
Vorstellten, bei der näheren Bekanntschaft mit Goebbels.
Later, when I began to know Goebbels personally, I also began to change the positive impression I had formed of him.
Etwas zurück und mehr in den Vordergrund, die etwas abgründige
The abysmal and fanatical side of his nature began to emerge.
Und fanatische Seite seines Wesens in den Vordergrund. Was sich als arbeitsmäßige Akribie auf der einen Seite zeigte,
The meticulous worker was also a cruel fanatic. Regarding the Jewish question, for instance, Goebbels was totally uncompromising.
Beispielsweise war Goebbels völlig unansprechbar.
As the local party leader, Goebbels had filled the streets of Berlin with Nazi ideology for 7 years before his rise to minister in 1933. If the relatively liberal Berliners, who had voted for food and jobs, thought high office would quieten Goebbels down, they were quickly disillusioned. Within weeks, the Reich Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment made his notorious speech demanding a boycott of Jewish businessmen.
haben wir die Feinde des Landes zu Paaren getrieben.
Not at this point threatening Jewish lives. The message was clear. Nazi ideology would deliver on some of its promises and all of its threats.
Vollzieht sich mit einer schlagartigen Wucht, aber auch mit einer imponierenden Manneszucht und Disziplin unserer Partei und unser Führer. Heil! Heil! Heil!
So sehr er Propagandist war.
As much as Goebbels was a propagandist, he was also very adept at keeping some things totally secret.
One of the best-kept secrets was to be the increasingly deadly persecution of the Jewish race. This early footage of Jews being dispatched to the east is a rare item from the Goebbels archive. Later on, only Heinrich Himmler's own secret camera unit was authorized to film Jewish and concentration camp activity, and its footage was routed to a special archive. Some film fell into the hands of the Allies in 1945, but most was destroyed by the Gestapo. This film was undated and bears the name of no cameraman. It also appears to be the only footage on the subject remaining in the West German State Archive. We found no cameraman able to witness the filming of atrocities.
Als ich Goebbels nun näher kam durch meine Arbeit,
Though my work brought me close to Goebbels, in the office, in the screening room, or at dinner in his home, I still got to know him only slowly.
oder im Filmvorführsaal, lernte ich ihn nun langsam näher kennen. Und es
The
enthüllte
picture gradually revealed to me was of a very precise, self-disciplined and hard-working man. A man who was a master of his business. Not just film and the written and spoken word, but also theater, music and the visual arts. Goebbels was himself an accomplished piano player.
Theater, Musik bis ins Einzelnste beherrschte. Er war nebenher ein glänzender Klavierspieler. Er war ein
Also, he was clearly a caring and loving father to his family, even though there were occasional arguments with his wife.
gleich er auch mit seiner Frau manchmal in dialektisches Gerangel kam.
The welfare of his children was always of great importance to him.
Kurz und gut,
In
es
short,
war
I had a
ein
very
so
favorable impression of Goebbels at that time.
das sich so in der ersten Zeit der Bekanntschaft bot.
The young propaganda minister's first big chance to show the Nazi regime in a better light to the world was in the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. Both the games and the film of them, made by brilliant director Leni Riefenstahl, were a triumph.
Beim Anschluss Österreichs konnte ich auch mitfahren und filmen, wie die Begeisterung.
After the annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, I went to Vienna to film the huge crowds which welcomed Hitler.
Es war eine helle Begeisterung, wie man sie sich gar nicht größer vorstellen kann.
After his cautious reoccupation of the Ruhr, Hitler conducted the reunion with Austria with confidence and panache. The sickly corporal of the First World War, the poor provincial boy who had failed to make it as an art student in Vienna, returned home a hero.
Ich weiß, die alte Ostmark des Deutschen Reiches wird ihrer neuen Aufgabe genauso gerecht werden.
He had laid the ghost of the Versailles Treaty, and hundreds of thousands of extras gave the scene everything cameraman Frenz could have wished.
Als Führer und Kanzler der deutschen Nation und des Reichs melde ich vor der deutschen Geschichte nunmehr den Eintritt meiner Heimat in das Deutsche Reich. Deutschland unser neues Glied, die Nationalsozialistische Partei und die...
One of Goebbels' tricks was to dub canned applause on the film of major public speeches. On this occasion, he didn't need it, but he couldn't resist dubbing a resounding anthem.
Then came the claims Hitler's towards Czechoslovakia. And this was a development which filled us all with anxious sentiments.
The price of Hitler's friendship to Britain and France was a license to extend Nazi protection to the German minority in Czechoslovakia. Poor Dr. Hacha, the ailing Czech president, was summoned to Berlin and met with a plenitude of oily greetings and intimidating salutes. The German cuckoo wanted the Czech nest, and Dr. Hacha, tiny and trembling, gave in. Next stop for Hitler was Prague Castle. The commentary speaks of a friendly and respectful welcome, but the film, unlike the Austrians in Vienna, features no mass of welcoming Czechs. Good public relations creates an atmosphere in which the client can work, and Goebbels presented every hawkish move by the Nazis as a contribution to peace. As Ribbentrop flew to Moscow to conclude the Soviet-German treaty, there was no hint of the secret codicil allowing these two unlikely partners to divide Poland. Lily Marlene was on the way. In case a few skeptics, such as, for instance, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, misunderstood the peace message, Goebbels placed in the same newsreel a powerful montage of German rearmaments. His Wagnerian approach to propaganda of this kind was by now well developed. The German peace had horns. The most baleful element of this newsreel was the goodwill visit by the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein to Danzig. It is now known that the battleship was fully armed and on war alert, a fact Polish patriots were to discover only too soon.
I was sitting in the opera house with my cameraman on September the 1st when I heard Hitler say, at 5:45 we began shooting. We were shocked because all of us felt instinctively that something had started which would run off the rails.
Orders for the Schleswig-Holstein came when it had barely put to sea. It turned right around and pounded the Polish naval base at Westerplatte, close to Danzig. The cameramen were in Poland from the first day, though their uniforms were a little makeshift. At left is Goebbels' chief cameraman, Erich Stoll. As the cameras were producing an enthusiastic record of the German blitzkrieg, a strange scene was being played out at Führer headquarters. Ribbentrop's news that Britain and France were declaring war was met with disbelief, then consternation. Hitler was stunned. Poland was his first miscalculation. In a rare moment of frankness, Hermann Goering said to Hitler, "This is the beginning of a serious time for us all. God help us if we lose this war."
Es liegt auf der Hand, dass mit der Ausweitung des Krieges der Bedarf der Propagandakompanien.
As the war spread, the propaganda companies were crying out for more and more cameramen.
Oder konnten überhaupt zurückgreifen zu Beginn
At the beginning, we had about 80 cameramen drawn from feature, documentary, and cultural film units.
Kulturfilm und so weiter, 80 Kameramännern.
They were fully trained professionals, but there weren't enough of them to go around theaters of war stretching from Norway to Africa.
Über Norwegen, Afrika bis in die fernsten Fernen reichten. Es kamen etwa in einer Woche 80.000 Meter an Material zusammen, die auf 800 Meter zurecht.
To provide new cameramen, I established a school in Berlin, which in the course of time trained 360 cameramen and sent them straight into action.
Ich habe da eine extra Schule in Berlin eingerichtet und wir brachten es dann im Laufe der Zeit von den 80 auf insgesamt etwa 360.
Sadly, 131 cameramen from our school were killed in action.
Und die leider einen sehr hohen Blutzoll zu entrichten hatten.
By the start of the invasion of France, 8 months later, hundreds of additional cameramen had been trained and the best possible equipment bought throughout Europe and the United States. To Goebbels' annoyance, he had competition. After Poland, the Luftwaffe had rushed out a film which didn't fail to flatter its own part in the victory. In France, the army was determined to get in first. The speed of the French collapse caught the army filmmakers by surprise, and they had to restage certain battles under the direction of General Rommel, then a divisional commander. Goebbels, in a huff, refused the resulting feature called Victory in the West a certificate of merit on the grounds that the film wasn't up to standard. The army was furious.
Heute weht über den Inseln die deutsche Flagge.
Hitler still had hopes of avoiding a total conflict with the British Empire. The newsreel commentary contented itself with warning the British to stay out of European, which now meant Nazi, affairs. Immediately after the occupation of the Channel Islands, Goebbels' cameramen were seeking out the images which would impress on the audience back home that the German army was now on British territory. They had a bit of fun with a British Bobby, strangely turned military chauffeur. Almost certainly the shot was a setup.
Pausenlos brausen die deutschen Geschwader nach England. Unter uns englisches Land.
The Give 'em Hell commentary to this German film of a night raid on London docks in September 1940 gave no hint that the Battle of Britain had been raging for 2 months with fearful losses on both sides.
Englische Scheinwerferbatterien durchsuchen vergeblich den Nachthimmel.
The English searchlights scan the sky in vain, says the commentator. The English anti-aircraft guns are wildly inaccurate. It projects that Goering's bombers come and go as they please. The truth was that 1 in 4 of these bombers never returned home.
Weit und breit sieht man das wilde Feuer.
Within 2 weeks of this film, Hitler virtually admitted that Goering had lost the air war by postponing Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade Britain.
It bears repeating that hardly any of the hundreds of cameramen working at the front knew what became of their work later on, or ever got to see it.
Und auch später einmal kaum jemand gesehen hat, was aus seiner Arbeit im weiteren Verlauf wurde. Seine Aufnahmen gingen zunächst einmal in
The
die
footage went first to the laboratories, and when developed, went to the propaganda ministry.
dann ins Propagandaministerium, wo täglich ein großer Stab der verschiedensten Fachoffiziere mit Vertretern der verschiedensten
In the
Ministerien.
ministry, the film was looked at several times by staff officers from the various armed services and by representatives from other ministries, mainly to censor any material of a secret nature.
Von vornherein zu eliminieren und unter Verschluss nehmen zu lassen, die irgendwelche Geheimdinge und so weiter beinhalteten. Das ganze übrige Material wanderte dann in die Zentrale.
What remained was sent to the Central Newsreel Department, where it was edited down to a length of around 1,000 meters.
Einen Reststreifen von 1000 Metern, der dann mit einem...
This rough-cut newsreel, along with the script of the proposed commentary, went every Sunday to Goebbels' home. This would happen every Sunday from the beginning of the war to its end.
Bis zum Abschluss und vom Propagandaminister hinsichtlich
The minister either approved this package or ordered changes.
freigegeben wurde oder aber modifiziert, umgeschnitten und so weiter und so weiter.
The next day, the newsreel would go back to Goebbels with suggestions for the music.
Freigegebene Bildschnitt mit dem inzwischen auf dem Tonband verewigten Ton zu Goebbels, um noch einmal zusammen mit dem Musikvorschlag vorgeführt zu werden.
Goebbels always decided the music very carefully, choosing to put emphasis on this or that part of the newsreel. Only when Goebbels was fully satisfied was the newsreel presented to Hitler, who approved it personally.
Vorwärts peitschenden Märschen und so weiter zu unterlegen. Erst dann ging diese Fassung an Hitler, der ebenfalls seit Beginn des Krieges die nun von Goebbels freigegebene Bild-, Text-, Ton-Version ansah und erst als
If Hitler gave it the nod, the print could be released. The newsreel would be rushed back to the laboratories and released in its thousandfold to German and foreign cinemas.
Kopien ins Deutsche Reich und ins Ausland.
The Berlin Victory Parade in the summer of 1940 was probably the zenith of Hitler's personal popularity in Germany and clearly a time of great joy for Goebbels. Having ultimate approval of the newsreel, the two Nazi leaders must have spent hours on this one. It had to project Hitler as the victor ludorum of European power politics. A difficulty for cameraman Walter Frenz was that bright lights made Hitler uncomfortable. Frenz worked with the technologists to develop faster film and a faster shutter so that the Führer wasn't continually blinking into camera.
Neben meiner beruflichen Filmarbeit habe ich auch...
Apart from my official camera work, I privately took many color photographs, which were rare at that time, of Adolf Hitler and the important people who visited him.
Diese Aufnahme ist am Obersalzberg entstanden und ich glaube, es ist
This photograph, I think, is one of the most human ever taken of Hitler. He was relaxing at the Obersalzberg, and he had just caught sight of Eva Braun walking towards him.
This color portrait of Eva Braun is the only one to have survived. In 1945, Walter Frenz was ordered by the SS and under threat of death to destroy all his negatives. A major propaganda success for Goebbels was in persuading the German Navy to take aboard newsreel cameramen from the start. This was in direct contrast to the British Navy, which refused to accept them until later in the war. Several U-boat commanders became national heroes in Germany, and exciting footage, such as this record of the sinking of a British freighter, caused a great stir in the neutral nations.
Wieder ein Treffer. So steht die deutsche U-Boot-Waffe Pau.
Goebbels was winning the propaganda prize hands down.
Die Spannung, unter denen diese Leute im Boot ihren Dienst verrichtet haben.
The crucial thing was to be able to make a record of the tensions under which these seamen worked. The captain gave me permission to install extra lamps, which helped me produce good filming conditions. I also had a special submarine camera, a standard Ariflex, but with a casing engineered for me by a shipyard.
Hergestellt für mich wog 85
It
Kilo.
weighed 85 kilograms and was pressure-proof to a depth of 140 meters.
Dieser Sicht konnte ich ganz herrlich
It allowed me beautiful shots above and below water.
also unter Wasser faszinierend waren und in den Wochenschauen sehr, sehr.
And the newsreel was thrilled with them.
Herbert Lander's film of a daring reconnaissance of Canada's St. Lawrence Seaway in a U-boat commanded by Captain Endrus in late 1941 won him congratulations from Goebbels himself. Early in the voyage, the U-boat had to endure a depth charge attack by a British destroyer, and Lander's film brilliantly conveys the tension, fear, and discomfort of such a moment.
Achtung, Schraubengeräusch in 60 Grad. Sie kommen näher. Ein Zerstörer jagt das Unterseeboot. Wasserbomben! Ein deutsches U-Boot auf Feindfahrt im Atlantik. Mit einem anderen auf gleichem Kurs fahrenden Boot ist ein Treffpunkt vereinbart worden. Ein neuer
Slightly damaged, the U-boat rendezvous with another submarine to take aboard spare parts. When the two boats surfaced, they claimed to have a view of Long Island, and it is probable they were inside U.S. territorial waters.
Die Verbindung ist hergestellt. Es ist geschafft. Als Dank wird eine Flasche Sekt hinübergeschickt.
The two skippers exchanged champagne, but they knew they were fishing in murky waters. The United States was still neutral, but there was a real risk of being arrested by the U.S. Coast Guard or having their location signaled to British and Canadian naval forces in the area. Lander adds wryly, they didn't pause long to drink the wine before diving.
Stunden sind vergangen. Blick durch das Seerohr. Das Boot liegt weit in...
Canadians living along the shores of the St. Lawrence would have been eerily surprised to know they were being observed through a German periscope.
Der kühne Plan des Kommandanten ist geglückt. Das deutsche U-Boot steht hier viele Kilometer tief in Feindesland.
The newsreel was a big hit with German audiences.
10th October 1941. Dear Lieutenant Lander, I congratulate you for those marvelous U-boat shots which I have just seen in the newsreel. Yours sincerely, Dr. Goebbels. Suddenly we faced a two-front war, and it made us nervous indeed.
Auch das sind Sowjetsoldaten.
Wir wurden in unseren pessimistischen Erwartungen mehr als bestätigt.
Our worst fears came to pass when after the big initial successes, the first winter came, and the army was bogged down in ice and snow.
Der Siegeszug in Eis und Schnee stecken blieb.
November through February were the worst months of that first Russian winter, and Germany's front-line troops suffered terribly. The troops' winter clothing, although ready for dispatch from Germany in October, did not arrive at the front until late February. The cameramen suffered along with the troops, and the veterans of the Russian front now suggest they were victims of an incipient act of sabotage. The Quartermaster General of the Army was General Eduard Wagner, who was later implicated in the plot to kill Hitler. The commentary reminded civilians how insignificant were their burdens compared to the sufferings of the soldiers at the front. This change of tone would remain. The German army was no longer unstoppable.
Bei der Belagerung von Sevastopol hatte ich auch die Aufgabe vom Führerhauptquartier aus.
During the siege of Sebastopol, I was ordered to film the giant 84-centimeter gun in action. To do so, I stood outside alone for the moment of firing, while the entire crew withdrew into a shelter. The blast nearly took my ear off. But far away, I could hear and see the shells exploding on the Maxim Gorky fortress.
Western correspondents in Moscow had as much chance of filming the Red Army in action as getting a warm smile from Stalin, which is why this decisive theater of the war was so badly underreported. German audiences fared much better. When Goebbels thought the fortunes of the German army were on an upswing, as in the initially promising Crimean campaign, he rushed top people such as Walter Frentz and Horst Grund to the spot. Fortunes often changed again even before the cameraman arrived, or in Frentz's case, changed while he was actually filming the action. This attack ended in disaster, with at least half the gun crew dead even before the film was shown in Germany.
Danach allerdings kam ein Feuerüberfall seitens der Russen.
Very soon afterwards, the Russians counterattacked, and a great part of our artillery crews were killed.
But as presented to German audiences, with script by Joseph Goebbels and music by Franz Liszt, it became an aria to victory. Goebbels could delay the truth of what was happening on the Eastern Front until the fall of Stalingrad in February of the following year. Maintaining optimistic propaganda on the home front was another matter. Allied air supremacy was all too obvious to the civilian population on the ground. Goebbels' tactic was to return to the atrocity ploy which British propaganda had used so successfully in the First World War. He portrayed the Allied air crews as barbaric and indiscriminate. The commentary said, churches, cultural monuments, schools, hospitals, these are the favored Anglo-American targets. The enemy's lust for destruction is costing the world irreplaceable values. Goebbels' poorly thought-out speech after the fall of Stalingrad tried to persuade Germans that the loss of 600,000 men was a necessary sacrifice on the way to the final victory. The army was appalled. It was at this point that Goebbels settled any doubts about his genius as a propagandist. Goebbels' February 1943 Total War speech in Berlin's Sportpalast has been credited with reuniting the German people and armed forces to Nazi war aims with a swiftness no one thought possible, except, of course, Joseph Goebbels. It was a triumph.
Do you want a more total and radical war than you can now imagine? I ask you, are you ready to endure anything and everything to help the Führer win this war?
Vor 40 Jahren stand ich mit dieser
40
Doppelkamera.
years ago, I stood with this double camera overlooking the Messina Strait. We knew it as Hellfire Strait. I devised a double camera because my friend and colleague Arthur König had been killed.
Ich stand mit zwei Kameras und konnte nur eine bedienen. Ergo habe ich
I built this double camera on one optical axis, and so I could shoot two negatives at once of scenes like a falling airplane or a falling bomb.
Abstürze und Bomben. Auf Fährschiffe. Alles war doppelt vorhanden. Natürlich.
I had two of everything, and the editor back in Berlin loved it.
Ein großes Ereignis.
Cameraman Grund's contribution to Goebbels' Total War was interesting, if only cosmetic. Playing about with two negatives of the same action gave his editors back in Berlin much amusement. One bomb bursting in the Strait of Messina became two. One Allied fighter shot down also became two. If film trickery won wars, Goebbels might have suggested naval cameraman Grund be promoted admiral.
Ich hatte vom Führerhauptquartier auch den Auftrag,
Führer headquarters ordered me to film the Atlantic fortifications, the Atlantic Wall, which stretched from the Spanish border to Denmark.
bis hinauf nach Dänemark. Das sollte auch zugleich eine gewisse Kontrolle sein, wie weit die
The
Befehle.
film would also record the state of readiness.
Bei dieser Gelegenheit habe ich dann auch
I was also to film the biggest of the guns pointed against Britain, known as the Batterie Großdeutschland.
Hier sehen Sie sie in der ganzen Wuchtigkeit. Sie war direkt am Kanal am Kap Grigny aufgestellt.
Walter Frenz jokes that he was sent on this tour of duty just to prove to Hitler that the Atlantic Wall was really there. About the same time, Field Marshal Rommel was filmed at the wall telling German audiences that the Allies would never achieve a successful landing. D-Day brought a predictable response from Goebbels. The generals might be confused, but the armchair warrior in Berlin had no doubts. We shall hurl them back into the sea, he told Germany. Yet even as Goebbels pondered yet another call for national unity, an all-or-nothing plot was underway in high German military and diplomatic circles, which was to give the Nazi leadership its biggest political shock since coming to power. Here, on the evening of July 20th, 1944, the treacherous General Fritz Fromm, commander of the Home Army, handed a death warrant to an aide and ordered him, "Shoot this colonel whose name I have already forgotten." The colonel was Klaus von Stauffenberg. At noon on July 20th, Stauffenberg, acting for a group which planned to oust the Nazis and negotiate a peace with the Allies, had planted a bomb in Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. Hitler's life was saved by a heavy oak table, and he lived to tell his old friend Mussolini about his astonishing escape only hours later. The two worn-out dictators had managed 32 years of government between them. But in their strained and shadowed faces could be read the beginning of the end. Stauffenberg had not acted alone, and Hitler moved to exact a terrible vengeance. The trial of the principal plotters began August 7th, 1944, here in the outwardly impressive People's Court in Berlin, now the offices of the Allied Air Traffic Control Commission. By filming the trials, Goebbels left behind a record of bullying Nazi injustice, which must have been as damning then as it is now.
Als wir am Sonntag, den 6. August,
We drove on Sunday, the 6th of August, 1944, from the Mommsen Stadium to the People's Court to meet our chief cameraman, Erich Stoll.
der schon einige Vorbereitungen für die Aufnahmen vor dem
He was already setting up our filming of the hearings next day.
7. August vorgenommen hatte. Es hieß dann, dass wir am besten alle gleich
He wanted all of us to spend the night in the courthouse so as to make an early start the following morning.
vorbereiten zu können.
Then, as now, Frau Erna Meyer ran a neighborhood bar close to the court.
It was a morning of great excitement. Only the people living here were allowed into the street, and they had to have special permits. No car was allowed through.
In a sealed street in a courthouse crammed with police and SS guards, this travesty of justice began under the presidency of the notorious judge, Roland Freisler. To enable cameraman Heinz Sasse to obtain head-on shots of the defendants, he had to shoot over Judge Freisler's shoulder from a spy hole cut into the swastika flag just above a bust of Hitler.
Stauffenberg die Kriegslage negativ, sogar pessimistisch beurteilte, war mir schon Ende März bekannt. Nun sollte durch eine Überstürmung...
Major General Helmut Stief described his conversations with Stauffenberg and the development of the so-called Berlin solution, that is, the killing of Hitler, in the calm tones of a staff officer discussing a military option.
Nicht mehr möglich sein, den Führer rechtzeitig zu ermorden, war immer in das Deutsche übersetzt. Was sollte dann geschehen?
Dann sollte mit Hilfe der sogenannten Berliner Lösung diese westliche Einzelaktion ergänzt werden.
Sind Sie Kommandierer General des Panzerkorps gewesen? In diesem Krieg waren Sie in Polen und Frankreich und in Russland. Und Sie hat der Führer 1947 im Reichstag zum Generaloberst befördert. Und dann, ich habe das zweimal nicht gesagt, die Möglichkeit ist ja nicht wegen Ungehorsams zu freigreifen.
Und dann sprach der Generaloberst Beck noch einige Worte, indem er sagte, ich denke in diesem Augenblick an die Zeit von früher her, und da unterbrach ihn Fromm und sagte, die wollen wir jetzt gar nicht erörtern, der bitte ich zu halten.
Colonel General Erich Höppner, a successful commander, described with graphic detail events in Army headquarters the evening of the failed coup, including the suicide of the former Chief of General Staff, General Beck.
Ist denn das richtig losgegangen? Und in dem Augenblick sagte Fromm, helfen Sie dem Herrn.
Helfen Sie dem Herrn?
Jawohl. Zu zwei Offizieren, die links von ihm standen.
Ja.
Und diese beiden Offiziere gingen auf ihn los und er sackte also in den Sessel, der hinter ihm stand. Dann sagte er, nehmen Sie ihm die Waffe ab, sagte Fromm. Und dann sagte er, nein, nein, die will ich behalten. Bitte sehr, Sie haben Zeit für den zweiten Schuss. Er sagte, bitte kommen Sie mit mir mit. Ich weiß nicht, was ich tun soll. Wollen Sie denselben Weg gehen wie Beck? Sonst muss ich Sie verhaften.
Ja.
Aber er sagte ihr, Frau, ich fühle mich nicht in dem Sinne schuldig und als Schweinehund, dass ich jetzt selber mich richten muss. Ich will das, was ich getan habe, auch von meiner Familie verantworten.
Heinrich Graf Feldorf.
Judge Freisler threw some of his cruelest sarcasm at Count Helldorf, the former police president of Berlin. Helldorf held the Nazi gold badge for long service, so he, in particular, had to be discredited.
Ich möchte einmal sagen, Ihr Zweifeln am Sieg bereits begonnen habe während des Vormarsches.
Freisler taunted Helldorf about his loss of faith in Hitler.
Wozu sind denn Volksmänner?
When he asked Helldorf why he thought the Führer had put him in his high office, Berlin's police chief could only roll his eyes and remain silent. The question was as rhetorical as the trial, and there was no more to be said.
The accused were only allowed to wear jackets and trousers, and their braces had been taken away. As their trousers kept slipping, Judge Freisler would yell, "You fool! You can't even keep your trousers on!" Freisler would also shout, "Fool! You wanted to do away with the Führer!"
Judge Freisler saved his most savage outbursts for two men who had qualities he abhorred: distinction and courage. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben was 62 years old and one of Germany's most distinguished soldiers when Judge Freisler, on Hitler's orders, went to work to publicly humiliate and degrade him.
Nun komme ich der zweiten Gespräch. Haben Sie bis dahin auch schon gemacht. Wie das war geschehen können.
Von Witzleben had commanded the German armies in Poland and France. Now, without belt or braces, Witzleben had to take abuse so strident that the sound engineer warned the judge he was wrecking the microphones.
Sie waren der Meinung, würde Ihnen Leben Ihr helfen. Wir sind allerdings des Glaubens, dass unser Führer Leben wohlbehalten.
German audiences were not allowed to hear von Witzleben's last brave statement. He shouted back to Freisler, "You can send us to the hangman, but within 3 months, an outraged and suffering people will drag your body through the streets." Next came the turn of the aristocrat Ulrich Count Schwerin, a young father and frontline officer whose family had lost a great part of their Prussian estates as a consequence of the Versailles Treaty. "Weren't you happy," shouted Freisler, "that the Führer gave you this chance to liberate your family's property?" I thought of the murders. Murders? Are you saying our actions in Poland were crimes? Are you not now destroyed by your infamy? Yes or no?
Ja oder nein? Da brechen Sie darunter? Ja oder nein?
Yes or no? Give a clear answer. No. Freisler halted the trials, saying he had heard enough. He handed down the sentences immediately. All the defendants were abominable traitors to the Third Reich. All would be executed without delay. Their property would be forfeit to the state.
Das Opfer unserer Krieger, Volk, Führer und Reich, sie werden mit dem Tode bestraft. Ihr Vermögen verfällt dem Reich.
One of the plot's few successes was that it began a rapid decline in Hitler's health, but nothing like as rapid as the decline of the plotters themselves. They had not been allowed defense lawyers, and there was no appeal against Nazi judgments. Within 3 hours, 8 of them were brought here to the execution chamber in Plötzensee prison, Berlin.
I was barely able to film the execution of one man when there came the next. Everything moved really quickly.
Led by Field Marshal von Witzleben, all 8 were hanged within 4 minutes. Another 153 persons linked to the plot were to die before Hitler was satisfied.
For the executions, they used nooses made of rope and not of piano wire, as has often been written or said.
Heinz Sasser's negative was destroyed by the SS, but a copy is known to have fallen into the hands of the U.S. Army. That copy never reached the National Archive in Washington. One conclusion must be that an American officer kept it as a macabre war souvenir.
When the young Adam von Trott passed by, he smiled into my camera. I can only say these men of the July 20th plot met their deaths honorably. Not one collapsed.
Unmittelbar nach der Hinrichtung.
Immediately after the executions, I had to hand over the 2 reels of film to a driver who stood waiting. I don't know whether he was from the newsreel or from the SS, but he took the reels from me, and we never saw the film again. After the horrors of that day, I said to my landlady, "What I have lived through in the last few hours will depress me all my life."
Hitler is known to have viewed the film at least 3 times. It amused Hitler that his senior generals found excuses not to watch it with him. Words alone couldn't stop the Allies advancing, and as the speeches got bigger, the weapons got smaller. In place of the great armies, Goebbels' oratory tried to mobilize a home guard of women, the old, the myopic, the flat-footed, and the very young. Gone from the newsreel were the great guns of the Atlantic Wall and Sebastopol. Instead, audiences were asked to identify with an awkward civilian army, making do with a scatter of small arms. The cameramen did their best, but a mini-submarine is a poor visual substitute for a flotilla of battleships and cruisers. The weapons of desperation in these last months of the war often themselves took a steady toll of life. The German Navy's so-called spring boats were a close equivalent to Japan's kamikaze air crews.
Lässt sich der Pilot über Bord fallen und ferngesteuert rast die Sprengladung auf das Ziel los.
Many who steered them failed to get out in time. Some leapt to death by drowning. Were these really the weapons to halt the Allied armies? Nor could the newsreel ignore the millions of Germans streaming back from the east. Hitler had gone to war to create Lebensraum, living space, for them. But now that promise of a sweet little home somewhere in the east had been thwarted by the Russians. Goebbels praised the German refugees' courage and discipline and promised them a safe and early return to their homes.
Die letzte Aufnahme von Adolf Hitler in der Reichskanzlei in Berlin.
The last film I took of Adolf Hitler was in the garden of the Reich Chancellery when he decorated a group of Hitler youth who had destroyed a Russian tank.
Mit der Abwehrwaffe, die damals auch die Zivilbevölkerung mit benutzen sollte.
In the ruins of the city he had promised would one day be more wonderful than Paris, Adolf Hitler was filmed for the last time by cameraman Walter Frenz, handing out iron crosses to German boys who had known no other leader.
Danach war ein Aufnehmen nicht mehr möglich.
After this, it became impossible to film Hitler because his hands trembled so much it could be clearly seen. Nor was it in the interest of the politicians to let the people see this weakness.
Es war sozusagen das Ende.
The end was near, and those of us still working close to Hitler found the experience deeply depressing.
How were the young to know what was really going on when still surrounded by Goebbels' lies? In Goebbels' last newsreel of the war, number 755, came one of the most desperate lies of all, a montage of massed panzer tanks which simply didn't exist anymore. Most of the crews were already dead. The film was 3 years old. In Görlitz, Goebbels made the last speech of his life. The master propagandist was as spellbinding as ever.
Wenn Sie jetzt an diesem oder an jenem Teil der Ostfront zur Offensive antreten, keinen Pardon mehr kennen und keinen Pardon.
The Führer was planning a new offensive which even now would lead his people to victory. Trust the Führer.
Jene Divisionen, die jetzt schon zu kleinen Offensiven angetreten sind und in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten zu Großoffensiven antreten werden, werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen wie in einen Gottesdienst. Und wenn sie ihre Gewehre schultern, ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen,
maybe seeking out every last pocket of civilian support, the professional atheist even allowed a fleeting shot of an elderly sister from a religious order. She may or may not have been there, but her image on screen is a curiosity. In the confident earlier years, Goebbels, a lapsed Catholic who hated Christian imagery, would have struck her out of the newsreel instantly.
Vergangenheit bewältigt hat, so wird er diese bewältigen. Ist fest davon überzeugt. Noch vorgestern sagte er mir, ich glaube so fest daran, dass wir diese Krise bewältigen werden. Und ich glaube so fest daran, dass wenn wir unsere neuen Offensivarmeen hineinwerfen, dass wir den Feind schlagen und zurückjagen werden. Und ich glaube so fest, dass wir eines Tages den Sieg an unserer Fahnen heften werden, wie ich je in meinem Leben an etwas fest geglaubt habe.
4 weeks before this speech, Josef and Magda Goebbels had decided to kill their children and themselves when the defeat came. The sacrifice of my family, said Goebbels, will be my last act of propaganda towards the German people. Cameraman Sasse was Uncle Heinz to the Goebbels children. It was he who filmed this birthday party, and the children singing, "I am so happy that you are born."
Ich freue mich, dass du
6 weeks later, on May 1st, 1945, the Goebbels family died.